Hitler's dark ambitions, his dreams and fantasies of Germanic world domination lie shattered amid the ruins of Berlin. The destruction of the perverted science of Nazism has involved the laying waste of the great cities of Europe and the loss of millions of lives. The spring of 1945 has seen Soviet armies rampage mercilessly through eastern Germany, enacting an orgy of sadistic revenge upon the people of the Third Reich. In the skies of Germany, the true strength of air power has been proven as American flying fortresses and British Lancasters fly unopposed and unchallenged to systematically rain destruction, city by city. As Allied armies penetrated ever deeper into the heartland of Nazism, the secret horror of Hitler's state was exposed to the world as the invaders encountered the camps and the victims of the final solution. The armies on all sides fighting in those last desperate days were aware that their leaders no longer fought for victory, no longer looked to the end of the war, but were contemplating the beginning of the peace. Stalin already regarded Britain and America with suspicion, seeing a deep conspiracy between his Western allies and their soon-to-be defeated enemy to confound and destroy Soviet communism. Already, the leaders of Britain and America did fear an expansionist Soviet Union that would seek to replace Nazism with another totalitarian dictatorship across a European empire. In the eye of the storm of flame and smoke that had engulfed his capital, Hitler had died by his own hand. Italian dictator Mussolini was executed, his body set to hang in public humiliation. As the people of America and Britain rejoiced in the streets, celebrating victory in Europe, already the battlegrounds of Europe were being prepared for a new confrontation. On the other side of the world, men still fought. There was still suffering. There was still World War. The great party that was VE Day was May 8, 1945. The surrender terms agreed that all German forces on all fronts were to unconditionally lay down their weapons and cease fire on the 8th. Yet fighting in Europe continued for days after. Isolated pockets of German troops fought on. Far behind the front line of fighting, deep in occupied France, fortress garrisons of German soldiers left as far behind as the Atlantic coast continued to hold out. These forces were surrounded and isolated and had been bypassed by the Allies as strategically unimportant in the big picture of the war. These troops were to surrender days after the official end of the war. In the East, Stalin did not accept the surrender, and he demanded that a separate peace be made. In fact, Russian soldiers were ordered to carry on fighting even after this Eastern truce. They pushed deep into Czechoslovakia, aiming to extend the area of territory that would fall under communist domination. It was 3 days after the supposed surrender that the Russians ceased fighting. By then, the Soviet forces had liberated the Czech capital city of Prague. Amongst the Nazi soldiers who fought in this last battle were a large contingent of ex-prisoners of war, former Soviet soldiers who had changed sides to fight against Stalinism. Millions of Soviet citizens had seen the Nazis as liberators. The fate of these men in the peace was to be grim: execution for the officers, long incarceration in the Gulag for the ordinary soldier. On VE Day, as Churchill stood with the British King George, acknowledging the adulation of the British people, he perhaps knew that, like Hitler, his time was gone. Churchill had come to power in the direst days of the war, as a man unassociated with the appeasement of the 1930s. Churchill's defiant and stubborn will to resist had been the only weapon in Britain's arsenal for much of 1940. He kept the war alive when it would have been easy to give in to Hitler. Churchill's scheming to somehow bring America into the war had led to the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. Churchill wanted the wartime government, a coalition of all British political parties, to continue into the peace. The British Labour Party refused. Churchill was forced to resign, and a general election was called. Despite being cheered wherever he went, Churchill's Conservatives were destroyed in the poll, with the Labour Party winning a massive majority in Parliament. Churchill had been a disastrous peacetime politician and was too close to the policies of the 30s that had brought poverty and mass unemployment. The mood in Britain was that the war had been fought to win a better future, and that the new peacetime world had to be better than the 1930s. Thus it was that in the last days of the war and the coming peace, Britain's Prime Minister was to be Clement Attlee, a small and quiet man, in many ways the exact opposite of all that Churchill was. It was to be Attlee that sat in Britain's chair at the Potsdam Conference, held between July 17th and August 2nd, 1945. Potsdam was to be the last great conference of the leaders of all three great powers. The Potsdam Conference was to shape post-war Europe, draw its borders, determine the type of society in which the peoples of Europe would live. The state of Poland was physically moved westwards into Europe. The USSR took eastern Poland. Poland was compensated by territory taken from eastern Germany. The Potsdam Communique described the move as temporary, pending a final peace conference. It authorized the ethnic cleansing of millions of Germans who were expelled westward. In fact, that final settlement was not to come, and the new map was not accepted by Germany until 1990 and the final withdrawal of Soviet armies. It's often forgotten that even in July 1945, the Soviet Union and the Empire of Japan were actually at peace. It was via Moscow that the Japanese had made requests for peace to America and Britain. Japan wanted a negotiated peace. The Potsdam Conference told Japan there could be no question of an honorable, face-saving peace, that their surrender would have to be unconditional, that the Japanese government would be removed, Japan occupied and stripped of colonies, that Japanese leaders would face trial for war crimes, and, above all, that Japanese society would be forcibly modernized and democratized. An image which came to be seen as an iconic demonstration of the total defeat of Germany was the meeting of Western armies, the troops of Britain and America, with those of Russia coming from the east. The unification of the two arms of Allied attack underlined the totality of Nazi defeat. The camaraderie of the soldiers, often staged for the newsreel cameras, was soon to dissolve and be replaced by mistrust and suspicion. At Potsdam, the decision had been taken that the territory of Germany would be divided into different zones of occupation, each under the control of one of the Allied powers. The Soviet Union came to insist that British and American forces, which had penetrated far to the east of Germany, pulled back, and the Soviet Union pushed its forces and the border of communist domination further west. Germany was divided between America, Britain, the USSR, and France. The German capital, Berlin, although deep in the Soviet zone, was also divided into occupation zones. Berlin was to remain an occupied city until the very last decade of the 20th century, an island of the West, deep in the Soviet bloc. Without any one of the three allies, America, Britain, or the USSR, the defeat of Nazi Germany would have been impossible. Of the three allies, the Soviet Union and its people made a tremendous sacrifice, paying the highest price in death and destruction. Theirs was the only territory that was to become a battlefield. It was Soviet soldiers that did most of the dying for the Allies. From a position of near defeat in 1941, as Barbarossa brought German forces to within the sight of the Kremlin, victory had fallen into the lap of Stalin and the Soviet system. What had begun as a desperate war of national survival ended with a triumphal reversal of fortune as the Red Army swept westward. The Soviet Union of the 1930s had abandoned any idealism of spreading world revolution. Stalin chose instead to build absolute power in Russia rather than indulge in political conversions. With Hitler's defeat, though, vast prizes of territory and population fell into Stalin's hands, and policy towards this new empire had to be improvised. It is a fact of history that Stalin was personally responsible for more deaths than was Hitler, and that Stalinism was a more encompassing and comprehensive system of terror than Nazism. Winston Churchill contributed a legendary phrase to the language of the world when speaking at Fulton, Missouri. He said,
"From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent."
Behind that iron curtain, 2 generations were to live as subjects of the Soviet Empire. Eastern Europe was to be an unhappy place from which its citizens sought only to flee. As Europe resumed normal life and contemplated the peace, the war in the Pacific reached its conclusion, and Japan was to reap the final fruit of its militarism and aggression. In August 1945, a single action, a single aircraft, changed history. A single B-29 bomber dropped a single weapon which devastated the city of Hiroshima, revealing to the world the greatest Allied secret of the war, codenamed the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. The nuclear weapon was built to be used against Nazi Germany, against the fear that German scientists, the discoverers of nuclear fission, were also building a bomb. As we look at the haunted and ghostly ruins of a city eliminated in an instant, we must contemplate that even in the spring of 1945, with Americans and British across the Rhine and Russian guns in earshot of Berlin, a German nuclear bomb dropped on a massed Russian army group, a nuclear-tipped V-2 missile fired at London, a nuclear V-2 launched from a U-boat at New York. For the Germans had designed that technology, would even at that last desperate late stage have reversed the fortune of war and brought Nazi victory. Germany had in fact neither the industrial resources nor the quantity of scientific expertise to build the bomb. Many of the scientists who built the bomb for America were themselves European exiles from Nazism. The Manhattan Project has a complete history of its own. An enormous enterprise that involved the construction of a vast industrial plant and the labor of more than 600,000 industrial workers. By the time the first bomb had been tested in the desert of New Mexico and bombs were ready for use, Germany had already been defeated. History must ask why the bomb fell upon Japan. The lessons of fighting at Iwo Jima and Okinawa showed that Japanese forces would fight to the death in defending the home islands of Japan. It is true that many thousands of American lives were to be saved by the use of the bomb. The saving of American life may in fact have been a byproduct of United States policy. It was clear that the Soviet Union was to become an enemy and that the atomic bomb would be a MasterCard in any dealings with Russia in the post-war world. The true horror and power of this weapon could not be described in words or in tests. Its awesome power, and what is more, the will to wield that strength, to unleash that horror, had to be demonstrated in war. As 78,000 lay dead or dying in the ruins of Hiroshima, a White House statement demanded that Japan surrender now, or expect a rain of ruin from the air. The Japanese gave no reply, and 3 days later, a second bomb fell upon Nagasaki. 25,000 died. The Soviet Union cynically declared war on Japan on August 8th. Their long-promised offensive was now no longer needed. Stalin used the opportunity of a certain and imminent victory to seize territory, islands in the north of Japan, and to occupy the north of Korea. In the end, Emperor Hirohito broke the deadlock and broadcast to the Japanese people 5 days after the attack upon Nagasaki. His broadcast never mentioned the word surrender. He asked his people to be prepared for the coming of peace. On September 2nd, in Tokyo Bay, General Douglas MacArthur took the surrender of Japanese forces.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
World War II was over. The celebration of VJ Day on August 15, 1945, once more filled the streets of America and Britain with celebrating crowds. Finally, the families of the two countries could look forward to the future with certainty. Already in both Britain and America, the process of demobilization for the armed forces and the realignment of society had begun. In the second half of 1945, in Britain alone, 170,000 men and women each month returned to civilian life, and war industry in both economies rapidly shed jobs. For many of these war workers, this meant that a delayed retirement could be enjoyed. For the many millions of women, the peace meant a return to a traditional female role, focused on home and family. This was the time of the baby boom, a time described as when everyone and her sister was having a baby. For the people of the two principal Western allies, the experience of homecoming stood in sharp contrast. Americans came home to a land untouched by war, with an economy and industry taken to new heights of efficiency, to a society brimming with confidence. British soldiers found a homeland that had seen many cities destroyed by bombing. They returned to a country bankrupted, with great power status eroded by the war, with its role as the center of a worldwide empire questioned and impossible to maintain. A major consequence of the war was the slow death of European colonial empires. The first and the most dramatic step in this process was the decision by the British in 1947 to set aside the jewel in the imperial crown, India. It is paradoxical and ironic that Japan had gone to war proclaiming its aim to be the liberation of the people of Asia from colonial domination, and that Britain fought its war in Burma and the Pacific to defend that empire. In the post-war world, a poverty-stricken Britain was unable to maintain the forces to rule that empire. It was a post-war Britain led by a government elected to sweep away the past and build a new Britain. A government with a socialist priority to build a new welfare state. The decision to quit India was taken quickly. Nearly 200 years of Anglo-India history were unraveled in just 2 years. The resulting division of the Indian Empire into a Muslim state of Pakistan and a Hindu India produced mass movements of population and many thousands of deaths in internal fighting. In the coming years, a wave of decolonization was to sweep the world. It was not a change of direction that was universally acclaimed. Many Britons wondered why the war had been fought if the price of victory was to be the demolition of all that they had been raised to hold dear. Winston Churchill showed himself totally disconnected from the post-war reality as he passionately and stubbornly argued for preservation of the status quo. With Indian independence, the British were beginning a long, slow, and gradual retreat from empire all over the world. The impetus to end empire was not always accepted with such realism. France felt the loss of great power status even harder than Britain. France had been defeated and occupied. The collaboration with that occupation by many French at all levels of society had stirred difficult and uncomfortable questions. In contrast to Britain, France attempted to reassert control over its empire. Most notably, it attempted to return to normal in Indochina, the land today known as Vietnam. No sooner had France found peace in Europe, it embarked on a war against the Viet Minh, the National Liberation Army of Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh. This was to be a long and painful experience for the French that would eventually cost them 90,000 lives, and the Vietnamese people millions. Decolonization was a result of World War II, and the war was to compound this strand of history even further. Simple struggles for national independence became entwined with the Cold War, the confrontation between the Soviet Union and its former allies. The Vietnam War became a battle of the Cold War. The Viet Minh were to become the Viet Cong, communists armed by the Soviet Union, while the French came to be armed and financed by the United States. Indian independence created a massive new democratic state from the second most populous people on Earth. Because of World War, China, the largest nation on Earth, underwent a no less dramatic change, but not to democracy. China had suffered longest of all, enduring invasion and occupation since 1937. A long civil war fought between communist revolutionaries led by Mao Zedong and the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek had merged into a tangle of conflict with the war against the Japanese invaders. A war of shifting alliances, of betrayal and factionalism had spread out across the vast Chinese countryside. Once the Japanese had collapsed in defeat, the Civil War resumed, and techniques of revolutionary war perfected by Mao were turned against the nationalists. Despite American backing, the result was defeat for the nationalists. The nationalists retreated to the island of Taiwan to set up a government in exile. In Beijing, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China, and a new thread of history sprang from the source of World War II. A direct result of the Second World War was the creation of a new state, Israel. The British Empire famously stretched around the world. A small corner of that vast dominion was the territory of Palestine, acquired in the aftermath of the First World War from the ruins of the Turkish Empire. Britain had then promised to establish a national home for the Jewish people, a vow that had remained unfulfilled. In 1945, as the revealed horrors of the final solution became known, the impetus to establish a Jewish nation became irresistible. Palestine became racked by terrorism, with shootings and bombings of British forces. Crowds of young Jews stoned British soldiers, and the British Navy intercepted ships carrying Jewish settlers, many of them survivors of the death camps. Palestinian Arabs refused to become part of any Jewish state. A succession of attempts to find a diplomatic solution failed. There was no compromise possible between British, Jews, and Arabs. Britain's withdrawal in 1948 was, in effect, an abandonment of an insoluble problem, and the new state of Israel was born into war. All conflicts advance both the techniques and tools of the art of war. Scientists and engineers are inspired to invent new weapons. Commanders rise to the moment and devise new types of fighting, or they grasp the potential of new weaponry to be used in classic ways. World War II was no different, bringing forth a massive arsenal of new and terrifying weapons. The World War II inventions of the ballistic missile and the nuclear bomb, when combined together, have changed all subsequent history, despite never having been used in anger. A military art was created that was no less history-forming than the bomb. In the struggle against occupying armies, irregular, low-technology warfare came to be perfected. In occupied Europe and in occupied China, the professional, highly trained armies of sophisticated industrial societies were engaged by partisans, resistance fighters, and guerrillas. These wars were political, about controlling populations as much as territory. The tactics were those of ambush and sabotage, the random terror bombing, and the murder of collaborators. Often, these resistance armies married nationalism to revolutionary communist politics. To this very day, in wars all over the world, in Vietnam, Kenya, and in Cyprus, in Northern Ireland, Zimbabwe, and Cuba, the wartime invention was used by often small, motivated, and fanatical guerrilla armies. The United States of America emerged from World War II as a world superpower, able to project an overwhelming and absolute force anywhere in the world. America had developed total industrial and economic superiority over the other nations of the world, and developed an armament industry capable of producing sophisticated weaponry, the match of any other state. Historians can convincingly argue that the USA enjoyed a similar dominant position after World War I, yet had turned its back on the world in an isolationism that had helped to create World War II. Those who do not understand their history are condemned to repeat their past. The United States understood its history and had resolved not to repeat the error of 1918. In 1945, the USA assumed a preeminent position in the post-war world. Despite a promise by Roosevelt that all American forces would be home within 2 years of peace in Europe, his successor Harry Truman saw the transformation of the USA into a European power, with permanent garrisons of troops in Europe and as the leader of a new transatlantic alliance. The Europe of 1945 was, in fact, a desperate wilderness of ruin and human tragedy. In Britain, the joy of the victory and the peace was soon to be tempered by a harsh reality. The hardships endured by the British people increased with the peace. Britain had enjoyed a wartime lifeline, the American Lend-Lease program. Vast quantities of goods and food were supplied by the United States free of charge. On August 15, 1945, President Truman suddenly and abruptly ended Lend-Lease. America suspected that the British were actually using Lend-Lease to subsidize their economy, that Lend-Lease supplies were being re-exported for cash. The result for the British people was a decrease in the food ration, lengthening queues and greater hardship. It is in the continent of Europe, though, that there were as many as 30 million of what bureaucrats came to call displaced persons, people driven from homes and homeland, sometimes stateless as well as homeless. Many of these were Germans who had fled from the East or had been ruthlessly ethnically cleansed from all over Eastern Europe. It was a professional United States Army soldier who was to do most to reconstruct and rebuild the ruins of Europe, giving these people new hope. General George C. Marshall had served through the war as United States Army Chief of Staff. Recalled to public service as U.S. Secretary of State, Marshall formulated a massive program of economic aid that was to come to bear his name. The Marshall Plan was an enormous transfusion of wealth that enabled Western Europe to regain stability and prosperity. The victory of 1945 allowed Stalin to feed his paranoia and push back both borders and potential enemies. The map of the post-war world was drawn, with Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria all becoming communist countries built to a Stalinist plan. Forbidden by Moscow to apply for Marshall aid, they struggled to rebuild and condemned their people to the grim austerity that was to characterize Eastern Europe. The war was still being fought as in San Francisco, the foundations of a post-war system of international security were laid. This was the United Nations Conference and established the organization we know as the UN. The new organization was designed with the lessons of history in mind. Following World War I, the League of Nations had been established as a worldwide peacekeeper, and its failure in this task was a major cause of the Second World War. In designing the United Nations, the states of the world learnt from the failings of the League. The League of Nations was a club that had at first refused to allow Germany or the Soviet Union to join. America had turned its back on the League and never joined. The UN was inclusive. Any state who wished could join, and all major powers took a dominant role. In the 20s and 30s, it had been too easy for a state that wished to simply ignore any censure or sanction by the League. Hitler simply left. Japan and Italy ignored sanctions over Manchuria and Ethiopia. Too often, the League had seemed slow and indecisive. Its last act had been to expel the Soviet Union for its invasion of Finland in 1939. The new United Nations was designed to be everything that the League was not, with a structure that allowed decisions to be made and capable of fielding troops in its own name. The phrase trial of the century is a form of words debased by cheap tabloids as they use it to describe the bringing to justice of the common murderer. The real trial of the 20th century can only be that held at Nuremberg, Germany in 1946. The surviving Nazi leadership was brought to trial to answer for the crimes of the Reich. Like Hitler, many leading Nazis escaped justice through suicide. Those who stood trial were a mix of Nazi politicians, most notably Hermann Goering and Rudolf Hess, military officers, and civil servants and administrators. The defendants were charged with both breaking the existing international laws, such as the Geneva Convention, which prescribed the treatment of prisoners and enemy civilians, and with new charges, crimes against humanity. The trial was held before judges from all the Allies. Had history been different, how would the bombing of Germany and Japan's cities be judged? How would the submarine attacks of the U.S. Navy on Japan be seen? Above all, could a Stalinist regime accuse another of crimes against humanity? The intuitive truth remains that the Nuremberg defendants were able to defend themselves and were given a fairer trial than any Nazi court would give. The defenses that were offered included military and bureaucratic claims to be solely obeying orders, nimble-minded legal defense, fanatical defiance, and claims of insanity, of actions perpetrated under a mesmeric trance in the spell of Hitler. The Nuremberg trials acquitted some defendants. Some were imprisoned. Many were executed. Some died shouting Heil Hitler. Göring escaped execution by suicide. Horrors that rank alongside the final solution emerged in Asia. Japan's war criminals stood trial for crimes that included massacres of both civilians and prisoners of war, and even mass human vivisection. Again, many of these war criminals paid for their crimes with their own lives. Most prominent among the executed was ex-Prime Minister Eidekai Tojo. The Cold War in Europe started where World War II ended, in Berlin. In April 1948, the Soviet forces in the Russian zone of Germany blockaded the city. They refused to allow road or rail supplies to the western areas of the occupied German capital. The Communists did not use military action, afraid of risking war with America. Their intention was to starve the Western Allies out, seeing their influence and martial aid as undermining the Soviet position in eastern Germany. The Western nations, though, refused to back down and mounted the famous Berlin Airlift to supply the beleaguered people of Berlin. Aircraft flew day and night, carrying supplies of all kinds, even coal. It was not until a year's siege that the Soviets relented. The tense standoff between the two eventually nuclear-armed factions was to dominate nearly 50 years of world history. It was a war of confrontation, intimidation, and bluff. Actual fighting was by proxy in remote parts of the world. That the world of 1945 learned a lesson from the history of 1918 is shown by the treatment of the vanquished powers. The planes flew supplies to save the citizens of Berlin as much as to supply the Western troops. It would have been easy to abandon Berlin and its people to communist domination as not of strategic value. Long before a later U.S. president was to describe himself as a Berliner, those words were put into practice. Germany was not punished with the crippling reparations that had provided Hitler with such ammunition in the interwar years. The western sectors of Germany were rebuilt, given secure democratic structures, and eventually became a full member of the Western Alliance. Eastern Germany was eventually given a communist government, and within the Soviet satellites, East Germany became a fanatical hardline police state that entrapped its citizens behind a wall of concrete and steel. As a U.S. general was instrumental in the recovery of Europe, so it was with Japan. Douglas MacArthur, having received the surrender of the Japanese, became the governor of Japan and framed a new society. A democratic state that constitutionally rejected militarism and aggression. Through industry and hard work, the Japanese came to achieve the economic wealth and status in the world that they had sought through military aggression. Winston Churchill said that it was the World War II of numbers, of statistics, that terrified him the most. The war, when expressed in numbers, reveals a tremendous cost in human life and suffering, in numbers that lie beyond the ordinary imagination. The greatest numbers of lives lost were suffered by the Soviet Union and by China. The USSR lost 13.5 million soldiers and 8 million civilians. In the post-war Soviet Union, women were to outnumber men by a third. Such were the wartime losses. In China, perhaps 1.5 million troops were to die, but the total of civilian dead was over 20 million. Japan's ruthless ideology of racial superiority had seen a deliberate famine sweep through China as the imperial army appropriated entire crops. The defeated nations reaped the rewards of aggression. German armed forces had reached a peak number of over 10 million men in uniform. 3.5 million of those were never to return to their homes. 2 million German civilians were to die under the weight of Allied bombing and in the dreadful last days of the war in the East. Japan's armed forces were to total nearly 6 million. Nearly half of that number, more than 2.75 million, died, as did 1 million Japanese civilians. In the occupied countries, the experience of the war would be determined by race and political ideology. Occupied France lost less than 250,000 soldiers and 173,000 civilians, many to Allied air raids. However, in occupied Poland, Nazi racist ideology, a belief system that saw Slavic peoples as subhuman and Jews as the origin of all evil, worked to its logical conclusion. 6 million Polish civilians died, 3 million of those Polish Jews, one part of the final solution. Every occupied country in Europe shares in the final solution. It is, to some states' shame, that the non-Jewish population gladly collaborated with deportations to the death camps. Equally, some nations can be proud that whatever other collaboration was made with Nazism, no part was taken in the Holocaust. Denmark transported all its 5,500 Jews to neutral Sweden. Only 77 Danish Jews were to die. All Bulgarian Jews escaped due to the refusal of the Bulgarian king to allow deportation. Even fascist Italy refused to take part in deportations. It was not until the fall of Mussolini that Jewish Italians fell victim to Nazism. Poland was squeezed on two sides with attacks by an equally ruthless and sadistic Soviet Union. Of 1 million Polish servicemen, 600,000 did not live to see the peace. The discovery by the Germans in 1944 of the bodies of many thousands of Polish officers killed by the Red Army was one of the first indications that the Soviet Union was not the friendly ally portrayed in the newsreels. Compared to the dreadful bloodshed of World War I, Britain lost less than 500,000 servicemen and just 70,000 civilians. It is a fact of war that it is in defeat that armies are destroyed. Victors rarely have to pay heavily for their triumph. The United States fought largely a winning war. With a maximum of 16.5 million under arms, less than 300,000 Americans were lost. Perhaps less than 10 U.S. civilians were victims of the conflict. The number of deaths in the major combatant nations overlies a long catalogue of suffering, of death and loss that reached into all corners of the world. As many as 55 million lives were lost all over the planet. From when we first realize that now is preceded by a before, we become aware that we're traveling on a timeline of history that is personal and unique, and yet is intertwined with the big flow of history. The history of World War II is perhaps the defining moment in the history of humanity. Yet the place of the war in history is not absolute and fixed. It's a different thing to different people. The people of Germany, Britain, and France talk of World War II, 1939 to 1945. The people of Russia of the Great Patriotic War from June 1941 to May 1945. The United States of a war beginning in December 1941 and lasting until August 1945. For China, the war began as early as 1937. When did the war really end? The history of World War II is heavily laden with irony. The Nazi delusion and the Stalinist paranoia that the alliances and antagonisms of the war would somehow realign came true. A post-war Nazi plan dreamt of a united Europe, with the Mediterranean South turned into a holiday playground for the North, with a single currency controlled by the German economy. Japan talked of an Asian co-prosperity sphere, where the states of Asia, free of colonialism, would become independent leading economies, with Japan in the dominant position. The war becomes ever more remote in living memory as historians stand ever further back from the big picture of the 20th century. It may be that World War II is seen as part of a conflict that began in 1914 and ended in 1990. As the Russians finally left, as communism crumbled across Europe and a reunited Germany, a democratic Germany was allied to its former enemies in an ever closer political and economic union. There can only be a handful of people on this planet unaware that the war happened. To surf through the documentary programs of a multi-channeled media world is to experience a place where somewhere Hitler is always speaking. The tanks are always driving forward. The bombs are always falling. If we are unaware of the history of the war, then we know its mythology, where fact merges into fiction, in the Hollywood epic and the TV sitcom. Impossibly handsome commandos are always mounting daring raids on secret weapons, and bungling bank managers forever play slapstick comedy in Britain's Home Guard. A Spitfire victory rolls in the clear English sky of 1940. For the people of Britain, the Battle of Britain was fought in the heat of a glorious English summer. That is a myth. Records detail a climate wetter and cloudier than even the normal summer. The Red Army fights alone against the Nazi invader. It did not. Only American boots kept the soldiers fighting. For many nations, the mythology of the war remains a definition of national identity. In 1,000 reruns, it is the finest hour once more. We live with the results of the war and are, ourselves, the consequences of the war. If we seek any further evidence that our timeline is entwined with that of Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, we need only look at our own family history. The war was a time of passionate and hurried marriage, of shattered expectations, of futures and dreams lost with boys who never returned, of moments seized right here and right now for fear that happiness might be lost forever. Many of us owe our ancestry to the war, to parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents who met because of the war. Evil will always be present in the world. Its eradication is not in the power of men. Yet, if there was ever an action by men that aimed to eradicate evil, it is that war waged upon Nazi Germany by Britain and America. The history of the war is a complicated weave of the politics of national self-preservation and of power games. Yet, refine and reduce that history to its elemental facts, strip away post-war maneuvering for power, and the war is a struggle between good and evil. The world will never be free of wicked men who will arise, and through sheer aggression and envy, tap into prejudice and the basest of instincts. These men will start wars, and will perpetrate terrible cruelties. It is only through the history created by the millions of individuals who fought and died in World War II that we, in the present and future generations, shall know the dictator and the aggressor, and shall see the ideologies of hate and evil for what they are, wherever and whenever they arise. The lesson of the history created by those millions of men and women to both present and future is that we must never forget.